This morning we're continuing with our podcast of the prophetic writing series. We're dealing with the book The Messiah, and the subject today is Messiah and Yeshua the Messiah and the fulfillment of facets of prophecy. In our investigation that we did, we looked at all the prophetic utterances and we counted all the individual facets of prophecy, and we showed that Messiah filled in excess of 200 of these individual facets of prophecy through his birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection. And we're going to be going through those this morning, showing undoubtedly that Yeshua is Yahovah's Messiah, and there's no doubt of that. We see in the first prophecy we're going to be dealing with is in Genesis 22, 2-18, and deals with Abraham. And this prophetic utterance would have been given about 1800 BC, when Abraham lived. And it has to do with the sacrifice, and God shows Abraham to go to a particular hill in Moriah, not just any hill, a particular hill, and it mentions that in the text. And Abraham sets up the sacrifice, and he places Isaac on the sacrifice. And as he's about to slay Isaac, the Lord stays the sacrifice and says that a sacrifice will be provided. On that particular mountain, a sacrifice will be provided. And it goes on to say that because of Abraham's faith and obedience, that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through his act that he committed there on that hill. So we see various facets there of fulfilled prophecy through Messiah. Messiah was the actual sacrifice that was offered on that same hill about 1800 years later. And as Isaac knew that he was going to be the sacrifice, also Messiah knew through his ministry that he was going to be the sacrifice on that day. And so we see various facets fulfilled in that particular text. In the book it shows you the number of each particular occurrence with each particular prophetic fulfillment. The second one is found in Deuteronomy 18, 15 and 19. And Moses is speaking to the Israelites, and that would have been given around about 1400 BC. And it's Deuteronomy 18, 15 to 19. And Moses said, God will raise up a prophet like myself, like Moses, from among the Israelites, and the people are to listen to him. And if they do not listen to him, it will be required of them. And we see that this prophet is none other than Yeshua the Messiah. And it's indicated by God on numerous occasions. We see at the baptism of Yeshua that the Spirit of God descends, and there's a voice from heaven stating, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So God makes a declaration. And then we see in passages of the text in Mark 9, 4-7, dealing with the Mount of Transfiguration, that Messiah goes up this mountain with a few of the disciples, the inner circle, and Messiah goes and he converses with Moses and Elijah, and the disciples fall into a deep sleep, and they didn't see Moses and Elijah initially. And when they awakened out of the sleep, Peter sees Moses and Elijah, and he makes the statement. He says, Messiah, I'll build 3 tabernacles, 3 booths, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And then a cloud comes over them, and out of the cloud a voice speaks and says, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. It's not Moses that's got to be listened to, or Elijah. It's the Son of God that has to be listened to. And that's in direct fulfillment of that prophetic utterance by Moses, that God's going to raise up a prophet that the people are to listen to. So that particular prophet is Yeshua. And then we see David makes remarkable prophetic statements in Psalm 22. And that would have been written around about 1000 BC. And there are many facets of prophecy related to this particular psalm. And we see that the psalm starts with a statement, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we see that the whole psalm deals with Messiah's crucifixion and the result of his crucifixion, that the nations will worship and bow down. And we see that when Yeshua was being crucified that day on the just prior to the Jewish Passover, that he calls out the statement on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Signifying that what is written in this particular psalm is taking place. And in the psalm it says he was despised and sneered at, and that's exactly what happened with Messiah. These people despised him, and they called out that he should ask the Lord to deliver him and see if he will come and deliver him. And this is the statement that these people around the cross made of Messiah. And then we see the text in Psalm 22 says that he was conceived of God. And we see that in the Gospels it shows clearly that was Messiah was conceived of God and that God was his father. And later we'll be going through particular text showing undoubtedly that these texts in the Tanakh speak of God being the father of Messiah. And then it goes on to say that the bulls of Bashan have surrounded him, and they opened their mouths as roaring lions. And this was the crowd around the crucifixion, mocking and shouting out comments. And it says his bones were out of joint. And with the crucifixion of Messiah, when they placed him on the cross was first of all lying down on the ground when they nailed him to the cross. And then they lifted the cross up. And when they dropped it into its housing, there was a tremendous jolt, and that pulled the bones out of joint. So when Messiah was being crucified, his bones were out of joint. And then it says his heart was like wax within him. And there's a section in the crucifixion scene where the soldier wants to see if Messiah is dead or not, and he thrusts his spear into Messiah's side, and water and blood comes flowing out. And there's medical evidence that because the water and the blood was coming out of him, that Messiah died of a massive heart attack. And that's what happened to him on the cross. And then the psalm goes on to say his strength dried up like a potsherd, his tongue was dry and cleaved to his jaw. And we know that on the cross Messiah was exhausted and he cried out that he was thirsty. And then it says he was laid in the dust of death. And that was the scene with Messiah. He died on the cross as he was crucified. And then it says his hands and his feet were pierced. And that's what happened. When David was penning the psalm, this wasn't the type of a death that was meted out to criminals. They didn't crucify them. And this speaks clearly of Messiah with his hands and his feet being pierced. And they could count his bones as he was naked on the cross. They handed all his clothes out. And then it says in the psalm, they divided his garments among them and cast lots for his clothing. And this is precisely what happened. This is graphic picture of the crucifixion. It's undoubted that this is what this is revealing. And then it said that God will actually save him from this situation. He was not despised of Yahweh, who praised him and provided the sacrifice on Mount Moriah. This was a response to that prophetic utterance through Abraham that God was going to provide a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. And this is what's taking place when Messiah was being crucified. And the text says, from Yahweh comes his praise. And through this acts, all the ends of the earth have turned to God. And this is what has happened over the millennia. And over the millennia, in excess of 2 billion people have come to know God. And that's besides the other people that have come to know, that are justified by this act of Messiah, not knowing who Messiah was before his crucifixion and even after his crucifixion. We see that the sacrifice is efficacious for all peoples that have come to God, as Messiah alluded and said, you cannot see heaven unless you cannot see the kingdom of God unless you have been born from above, indicating that one needs to be born from the Spirit of God in order to be a part of God's kingdom. And Messiah died for all of these people, whether they knew him or not. This was the justification of their salvation. And then it goes on to say, those who have passed on from this life bow before him, and they declare his righteousness. So we see many facets of prophetic utterances full through that particular Psalm 22 of the crucifixion of Messiah. And then the next prophetic utterance that's remarkable is Isaiah 52 and 53. And that would have been around about 550 BC. Now we've shown in the book The Prophets and in various places that the prophetic writings in Isaiah belong to a period of about 200 years. And what happened there, that as Isaiah wrote, there was also a school of the prophets. There's always been schools of the prophets, and they also were writing and doing various things. And eventually, these school of the prophets that were with Isaiah, their prophecies were eventually combined with Isaiah, and eventually they were all called the book of Isaiah. But there are prophetic utterances from various prophets, and these in 52 and 53 are part of the later prophets. And in these prophetic utterances in Psalm 52, it says that Messiah will sprinkle many nations. And we see that this has actually happened. And then we see Psalm 53 starts off and says that the son of David grew up like a tender shoot before Jehovah. And we see this was Messiah, and that he was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And people hid their faces from him. Now that was a scene of the cross, the people despising him and hiding their faces from him. And they esteemed him stricken of God, yet it was for their sins he was dying. And that was actually the case that was taking place. And this psalmist actually gets insights into the purposes of the crucifixion revealed in Psalm 22. And then it goes on to say, and by his scourging we are healed. And we know that Messiah received 39 lashes by the Roman soldiers before he was crucified. And this speaks of that scourging. And it says, all men have gone astray, but the Lord has placed our iniquities upon him. And goes on to say that he did not open his mouth and went as a lamb to the slaughter. And we know that Messiah is the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. And that this prophet that was writing this prophetic utterances has insights into this and explains what actually took place. He died with wicked men, yet was with a rich man in his death. And this was the scene when Yeshua was crucified. There were criminals to the left and right of him. And yet there was a wealthy man in that Joseph of Arimathea was part of the Sanhedrin, and he was a disciple of Jesus. And he went to Pilate and pleaded for the body so that he could have a proper burial, and it was granted to him. And they took Messiah down from the cross and buried him in the tomb. And this rich man was none other than Joseph of Arimathea. And then it says he will be apportioned with the great and divide the booty with the strong. So we see Messiah glorified in his situation after that crucifixion, and many facets speaking about the fulfillment that he did on that particular day. And then we deal with the Passover Feast. The Passover Feast was prophetic, spoke about Messiah, and we see that Passover Feast occurred around 580 BC. We've shown that the priests in captivity backdated this feast to the time of Moses, but we see various evidences to show that that feast wasn't held before this time, and that this Passover feast was directed by God during the Babylonian captivity, when they no longer had a temple and held this particular feast in their homes, and each family would get together and they would hold this feast. It's explained in Exodus 12, 1 to 13. And they had to take a male lamb without spot or blemish and keep this aside from the 10th to the 14th day for roughly 3 days. And we know that lamb without spot or blemish was the Messiah. Messiah asked the question one day, and he said, "Who of you convicts me of sin?" And of course, We know that Messiah was sinless and died for the sins of men. And keeping that lamb aside from the 10th to the 14th, it's significant. It's roughly 3 days. And this is roughly symbolic of the 3 years that Messiah Messiah took in his ministry before he was crucified. Roughly a 3-year ministry. And in those 3 years, they could inspect him to see if they could find any fault in him. And no one could find any fault in him at all. And then when the lamb is slaughtered, the blood is placed in a basin, and they take a hyssop branch and they put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel of the door, of the wooden door. And this speaks of the cleansing through the cross of Calvary, and the upright beam would have been the doorpost, and the lintel would have been the cross beam. And Messiah actually bled onto this cross beam and the cross, signifying that Passover lamb was being slain. And Messiah was actually crucified on the day before the Passover, slightly before. And he actually died on the day that the lambs in that area were being slaughtered for the Passover meal. And very significant in that Messiah dying on that particular day. And we see that the Passover meal was eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And the unleavened bread speaks of the cleansing from sin, and the bitter herbs about the agony that it would cost Messiah to go through this particular crucifixion. And we see there are many other prophetic utterances. I'm going to deal with a few here. There are more in the book, and even more than in the book that are in the Bible, showing that Messiah filled in excess of 200 individual facets of prophecy. And each one of these facets, it's like a combination lock with 200 numbers. And you could probably, in any particular of these cases, there could have been 10 other things that could have happened. And if you look at the permutation of those particular combinations, it goes into hundreds of thousands of possibilities. And the chances of all of those things taking place in the life of one person is probably in the millions, and shows clearly that Messiah, Yeshua, is the Messiah of God. We see Isaiah 7:14 speaks that the virgin will be with child, and they will call his name Emmanuel, God with us. And Yeshua was a picture of God to us, and we look at his life, and that led the Jewish writers of the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 1, to state that in past times we've been spoken to by the patriarchs and by the prophets, but in this day we've been spoken to by the Son, and he is the exact image of the nature of God. And obviously they had insights, and what they were saying was that the previous ideas that they had weren't the exact image of the nature of God, but Messiah is the exact image of the nature of God. Then in Micah 5:2 we see Messiah was born in Bethlehem, the city of David. We see that Augustus called for a census of his kingdom, and that Joseph had to go to Bethlehem when Mary was expecting her first child, and that they went into the inn, and Messiah, Yeshua, was born, and he was in the manger in Bethlehem, as prophesied in Micah 5:2. And then we see Jeremiah 31:15 speaks and says, Rachel is weeping for her children who are no more. And that prophetic utterance speaks about the birth of Messiah, in that Joseph and Mary were warned by God to take the child, Yeshua, to take him away from that area, because Herod was going to send his military soldiers out to that area to slay every child under a few years old, to make sure that no king will be born that will usurp or take his kingdom. And then we see Isaiah 43:8 speaks of a forerunner of Messiah who would minister to the Israelites, and that speaks of John the Baptist. Isaiah 9:1-7, people of Galilee in darkness would see a great light. And we know that Messiah ministered in Galilee on many occasions, and he was the light to them. And many of them were in darkness and came out of that darkness into the light. Isaiah 35:5-6, he will heal the eyes of the blind and open the ears of the deaf. And we see that Messiah did that on many occasions and appears in all the Gospels accounts. Then Zechariah 9 verse 9 says, the king comes to Jerusalem riding on a donkey. And this is actually what happened. Messiah was on this donkey and rode into Jerusalem and wept over the city. And said he would have gathered them as a hen gathers her chicks. But they did not know the time of the visitation. And we see that was fulfilled by Messiah. Then Zechariah 11 verse 10 to 13, we see that Messiah is betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. And that happened. And Judas was remorseful and threw the money back into the treasury and went out and hung himself. So bitter was he for betraying Messiah. In the actual book, there are many more prophetic utterances showing, and we show clearly each one of these and how many facets Messiah fulfilled in each one of them. And we see it's over 200 particular facets of prophecy, showing undoubtedly that he is God's Messiah, Yahweh's Messiah. The reason why the Israelites did not accept him as their Messiah was that over the years, since the time of Amos, they built up this prophetic expectation, and we show it clearly in the prophets and in the book Jewish Apocalypticism. That what happened was that Amos took a bona fide prophecy of Messiah's crucifixion, where it speaks of the sun darkening from 12 noon, and that an earthquake will occur, and that the people will weep as if weeping for an only son. And we see all of those things happen with the crucifixion of Messiah, and are part of the prophetic utterances regarding the crucifixion. But what Amos did, he took that and he coupled it with his expectation, that would occur when the Assyrians were going to attack them. He knew they were coming to attack them because they had agreed not to pay the tribute. And they were under the impression that they had an alliance with Egypt to come against Assyria if they would attack them. But that never materialized. So Amos's expectation was that God would himself descend and be amongst them and judge the idolatrous Israelites, and that hundreds or thousands would be killed, and that he would judge them and judge the enemies of the Israelites, and that their sanctuaries would be laid waste, and that there would be a day of calamity. And all of these things, a part of them happened, but because they didn't all take place, they kept deferring all of these things out, and that was the forerunner of Jewish apocalypticism, and was based on expectations that didn't come to pass. And what they did, they kept pushing all these things out because they were never fulfilled. And on 5 or 6 occasions they believed it would take place. And even during the early church, they believed that when the Lord spoke of the destruction of the temple, they believed the Lord would return at that time, but it didn't take place. And it kept on being pushed out and was finally written into the book of Revelation. And we see that all of that apocalyptic expectation was based on speculation and is not prophecy from God and will not take place. So what happened was that the Israelites at the time of Messiah were expecting Messiah to come with an army and to defeat the enemies, and they couldn't fathom Messiah coming in humility and dying for the sins of people, and that's what happened on that particular day. So we see then that Messiah fulfills in excess of 200 individual facets of prophecy and shows undoubtedly that he is Yahweh's Messiah. And on that note, we finish this particular podcast. Remember that these books can be found Amazon.com, bookbaby.com. Just search under Ernest Austin Adams. Thank you for watching this podcast.